Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Wisconsin Icons. I'm Bob Dolan, and as always, I'm very pleased and grateful to have you with me on this episode. My title sponsor is Pasternak and Zergabel, www.injurywisconsin.com, award-winning personal injury attorneys. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Town Bank with branches all over Wisconsin. It's a great bank. It's my bank. And their website is www.townbank.us. My icon in this episode is Orson Welles. I'm a big old-time movie guy. The older, the better. I continue to be fascinated with how they created movies and produced movies way back when. And Orson Welles, to this day, is considered one of the giants of Hollywood history. He's the man, of course, who gave us Citizen Kane. Some think that's the greatest movie in history. And he's also the man who gave us The War of the Worlds, arguably the most impactful radio program of all time. Orson Welles won an Oscar. He won a Peabody. He won a Grammy. And in 1975, he won the AFI, American Film Institute, the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award. And to think, it all began in Kenosha, Wisconsin. My guest today on Wisconsin Icons is Patrick McGilligan, and he's the author of a book called Young Orson, The Years of Luck and Genius on the Path to Citizen Kane. Well, Patrick, it's great to see you. Welcome to Wisconsin Icons.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. There are many, many books about Orson Welles, and some of them are quite good. I had previously done a book about Nicholas Ray, who was born in La Crosse.
All right.
And I found that to be a nice way of doing business. You know, I could do a lot of my work from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And my editor at the time had married somebody from Wisconsin. So we were sort of joking about this while we were talking about our next subject, what it might be, because it's always something the editor likes as well as you do. And I said, well, you know, I think I could do an entire book about Orson and basically in Wisconsin or the Midwest and how that influenced his career. And I think I would stop the book before he actually directed a film. And he thought that was a rather audacious idea, as did I.
Yeah.
But he liked it. You know, he said, that's great. Let's do that. It was actually kind of impulsive.
Okay.
And, you know, Orson, I'm in Milwaukee, even though I'm born and raised in Madison. Well, Orson spent time in both places, as
Sure.
it turns out.
Sure.
But I'm up the road from Kenosha. So, and Kenosha is where he was born and raised. So my thought was, looking at the other books, that no one ever paid attention to the early years, or they just cobbled together a few sources and generalized about the early years. But my thought was that there was probably a lot to be found in Kenosha. It was a rather naive thought. And so I thought I could do a lot of my work close to home. And indeed, I did spend, you know, maybe the first 6 or 9 months driving back and forth between Kenosha, usually spending the day at the public library reading microfilm, which is not good for your eyes.
Absolutely.
But I'm good at it because I used to be a newspaper boy, so I know where things are in newspapers and I can read them very quickly. And it turned out there was a treasure trove. His birth is on the front page of the Kenosha News.
All right.
Because his mother was a prominent local politico and feminist and suffragette, and his father was also very prominent local businessman. And then they followed the family both forward in time until they left Kenosha, not long after he was born, because the father and the mother had a breakup, or they had the beginnings of a breakup, and they moved to Chicago to repair their marriage, and that didn't help or work. But I also then went back in time and read 20 or 30 years into the past of Kenosha newspapers in order to get the atmosphere and the origins of the people and why they were prominent and what was interesting about them. And, you know, honestly, it was luck because there was a great story there. I intuited that there might be, but one can be wrong, you know, but it turned out there was a lot of it in the newspapers and in the local history archives, and that it was a really, really wonderful sort of prologue to Citizen Kane, which included or foreshadowed a lot of the highlights of Citizen Kane. You know, the best, one of the best American films ever, and one of the best known American films.
Sure.
So it's a pretty big book. Uh, I always say, you know, don't drop it on your foot. You might go to the hospital. But it was surprisingly easy and fun because normally when I write a film book, I have to write about a lot of films,
Sure.
which involves pre-production, casting, script, then what the critics say, and then how it turned out on the screen, and then finally my own like opinion of it. This case, I didn't have to
Yeah.
because the film, the book, while the book foreshadows a lot, and a lot of other Orson Welles films and films that he was interested in are mentioned, the book stops when he calls action on the first take of Citizen Kane.
Oh,
That was
good.
always the audacious idea of the book, but that's what happens. And then there's one epilogue that takes place on the last day of his life when he has an appearance on the Merv Griffin show,
Mhm.
which then I try to encapsulate everything that's left out of, you know, the book after Citizen Kane. But it worked. And you know, it's would strike some people as a very difficult book, but honestly, except for the time and the effort, it was
Sure.
quite easy.
Sure. You've mentioned already, Patrick, the breakup, the painful breakup of his mother and father. But was his childhood, was it difficult? Was it happy? Does he have siblings, et cetera? I mean, did he have a good upbringing, a happy upbringing?
Well, these are two different questions, you know, and he would probably not believe in happiness, and so he would
Yeah.
preface anything he says by saying there's no such thing as a happy childhood. I think Merv Griffin asked him on the last day of his life, you know, is he happy?
Yeah.
Uh, he nobody knew it was the last day of his life, but you know, on his interview, is he happy? And I think Orson said something like, "No, no, no, but every day I have moments of great happiness," you know, which was a very wise and sensible reply. Let's start with whether it was a good upbringing. It was, surprisingly. His mother was a pianist and an artiste who would perform with the piano and sometimes do spoken word or songs to go along with it, and quite well known in the Midwest. And she performed at the predecessor of the Milwaukee Art Museum, for example. He had an uncle who was at the Milwaukee Art Museum as a professor and curator later on at the Chicago Art Institute. And his father was a businessman, and he was an inventor, kind of a inventor of gizmos for bicycles and cars. But some of them quite lucrative and practical and valuable in their time, which is turn of the century.
Hmm.
Uh, and later on became a businessman of bicycles and automobiles. When back in the days when we're seeing in Kenosha in particular, in that area were big boom areas for automobile and bicycle manufacture. And consequently, his father was considered a very high-minded, interesting local citizen, touted for mayor, you know, of Kenosha, that sort of thing. So these were really, really interesting people to have as your mother and father, and as your uncle, Dudley Crafts Watson, the artist, who was also a professor, who was also eventually an archivist at the Art Institute. And then their circle was all artists and high-minded people who wanted to go to plays and recitals and performances. And she put on shows, the mother did, both, and I don't mean just shows with herself, but with other people, in which she was either the director or the producer of the shows. And they were kind of, like local talent uh, displays, which were on a theme, let's say a July 4th theme or something. And so it was a very, very positive, and they both loved him. He did have a brother, an older brother who was eccentric, possibly because he had something wrong with him mentally, who kind of trailed after him uh, throughout life in various ways, and it becomes a kind of subtext of the story. Now his mother dies when he's still young, when he's still in prep school. He went to prep school in Woodstock, Illinois, so that's in the story too. Uh, he was the star of the prep school, organizing Shakespeare plays and
Sure.
acting and directing in them, and getting a lot of publicity in the Chicago newspapers. And so his mother dies, so he's in effect, and she dies after they're divorced. So he's in effect an orphan, but not really not. His father, by this point, had become kind of in decline, alcoholic, unstable, still, from all accounts, a lovely guy and loving. And they used to spend, their summers at a hotel that he briefly opened, the father, in Grand Detour, Illinois, which is at a bend of the river, which is at the time, was a artist and bohemian retreat, and was a very idyllic place. And so the artists from Chicago would go out there and paint. And little Orson, age 10, would set up his easel on the riverbanks and paint. So there's much that's positive, but what does he take out of it, for Citizen Kane is quite interesting. So he takes this orphan idea, and he creates the boy taken away from his mother. Well, actually, his mother gives him away to a banker who's he becomes a ward of the banker, and gets dragged away from his sled in the snow. This completely typical Wisconsin image. Even though in the script and in the movie it's taking place, I think, in Colorado, somewhere else. So he changes it. He himself also had a stepfather, because then his father dies after they take a kind of storied tour to the east and to Japan and China. And and when he comes back from that trip, the father, he dies, basically of alcoholic related diseases. And in his will, he gives him over to the mother's best friend, who was a doctor, Jewish doctor, very cultivated. And he becomes kind of the prototype of the banker, in Citizen Kane,
Yeah.
who is the ward of the orphan in Citizen Kane. And Orson's imagination makes everything more Dickensian, and there's more evil and more, but also at the same time, richer and more intelligent, in terms of storytelling. So I didn't know this starting out.
Yeah.
I knew none of this, or very little of this. And by degrees, it revealed itself to me as this wonderful, preamble to Citizen Kane. And then he's rising up, in his power as a performer and as a potential artiste. He even takes, after he graduates from prep school, rather than go to college, and he had very good feelers from colleges, including from Harvard. He takes a gap year, even though I think he's only 17. And he goes to Ireland with a donkey cart, buys a donkey, which pulls the cart, and travels throughout Ireland, and then ends up in Dublin and joins the Abbey Theatre, and begins to perform on stage as a teenager, playing old men.
Well, back then, I'm sorry for the interruption. Back then, the Abbey Theatre in Dublin was big stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's two theaters, and he kind of went back and forth between the two of them, and but he had big parts, even
Okay.
though, and then he also formed his own side theater while he was there. He went to England and met George Bernard Shaw. This is all before he's 20 years old. Then he
Yeah.
comes back and he begins to join professional theater and make a tour with a very important actresses company throughout America. So all this takes place even before he's known nationally. But he was very shrewd about publicity and self-promoting. So he's turning up in the Chicago papers all this time, and when he comes back from Ireland, they're covering him getting off the train.
All right. Yeah.
The big star,
Yeah.
the big child star, by then he's like a teenage star, has come back from Ireland. So there's no lack of story elements or drama or color or fun in the real story. And then to imagine how this story is shaping him as a human being into the person who we see on the last day of his life going on the Merv Griffin show.
Yeah.
The legend, the overweight, overbearing, egotistical, genius, that he became. That's fascinating to explore. And then all the parallels to Citizen Kane and things that show up in his movies or his work later on, things that either were real things that influenced him or artistic theatrical film things that influenced him. Those are very interesting to write about and think about as well. So Wisconsin has a lot to be proud of in film. And you could name, excuse me, I'm going to take a glass of water. You could name 5 or 10. I could. And it has a surprisingly rich tradition of film directors because Howard Hawks lived up in Neenah for a while. And there's Nicholas Ray and Joe Losey, both born in La Crosse. And there's John Hubley, the great animator, was born up in like Marinette or somewhere. And then you have Orson Welles, and he would be, number one in terms of stature and fame and greatness. But it turns out that in all cases, when you look at it carefully, Wisconsin had something to do with the kind of people they became, even politically. Because I said that his mother was very progressive, and she was very progressive, and this was drummed into him. And so at a later point in his life, when he's like in danger of being, blacklisted because he was so left liberal, he wasn't communist, but he was friends with people who were communists, and he supported a lot of issues that the Communist Party, American Communist Party, supported. He was very left-wing. He was approached and considered running for senator of Wisconsin, and considered coming back and doing it, sort of like Mark Ruffalo is nowadays. Right. But Orson was, as famous and great as Mark Ruffalo is, Orson was higher up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Was he? I should know this. Was he on Joe McCarthy's list?
Well, there are people that remember, I stopped the story before this.
Right. No,
I don't go into it in the book in great depth, but he actually chose to go abroad. And so there are some people that feel he was blacklisted in the sense that he was driven out of the country. And there are other people that think he was simply broad-minded and wanted to get out. And go work in Europe, which he did. And then Europe became a second home for him for basically the rest of his career. He was thwarted he had great success in Hollywood, and he was also thwarted in various ways in Hollywood. So when he could go somewhere else and get more creative freedom, he always decided to do that.
Yeah. You mentioned Patrick, obviously born in Kenosha, spent some time in Milwaukee, goes to Madison, ends up in Woodstock. So Woodstock, it sounds
he was in a summer camp in Madison, and on the out near where Picnic Point is today. Where he ran the camp newspaper and also appeared in their plays. And then this got him on the, I think it's on the front page of the local section of the Cap Times, with a photograph of himself looking like Orson, very serious, sort of like the thinker. With an ascot, and an interview with him as the boy genius, and he was 12 or 13. And then he went from there, because his father at that time was having a rocky time, and he was like I said, he was sort of on the downhill, and he was running this hotel, trying to run this hotel retreat in Grand Detour, Illinois. He stayed in Madison for a semester and went to school. And got in the newspaper again for the plays he was producing at this school. So for grade school. School. It was like Washington School. It was Washington School, which is nowadays, I think it still exists. It became the school board administration building many, many years later. But so everywhere he went, there were footprints.
Yeah. Was there a specific time in his first 20 years where the wider community looked at this guy and said, okay, this guy is, this guy's going to be special. This guy's, you've used the word genius already a couple of times. This guy is going to be one of the.
They were both. Yeah, the Cap Times was doing it, and the Chicago newspapers
when he was 13.
Now the Chicago newspapers are kind of being feted, by him and his stepfather who was real ambitious for him, and they all knew the mother because she was
Yeah.
performing, and
Yeah.
she was first of all she was beautiful, and then she was incredibly cultivated. So she was friends with the people at the symphony and the people at the museum, and that was her social circle.
Yeah.
So he had an in places, but when he went places where he didn't have an in, like Madison, he immediately created his own
Mhm.
avenue of success and local fame. So yes, everywhere he went, and then same in Woodstock, they where he went to the Todd School for Boys, which in this idyllic town, which is later the setting for Bill Murray's movie, where the time keeps
Yeah.
repeating
Yeah.
itself. And he was immediately famous locally and in the newspaper as this like amazing high
Sure.
school boy
Sure.
who's putting on full scale Shakespeare on a budget of $12,
Yeah.
and then taking the productions to the state championships.
Okay.
And we can only imagine that, because we saw the later result, both with Citizen Kane and then his lifelong career, that it wasn't all publicity and promotion, that this was a boy genius.
Yeah.
And a boy, to be fair, a boy genius in his area. I mean, he's not a boy genius scientist. There are things he wasn't good at. He wasn't a boy genius athlete. None of these things. But in the arts, he painted. He composed. He did poetry. He wrote and edited newspapers and yearbooks. And then he's putting on full scale production of classic plays. He was classically educated in these places, and he took to it. He took to a classic education, so he would put on classic plays, full length. If they were abbreviated or shortened, he did the abbreviation and the shortening.
Uh-huh.
And then he'd cast all of his bunk mates. It was all boys, Todd's School for Boys. Some of them would play girls, and he'd cast them all, and they would tour. Besides, this is in high school. So I'm saying everywhere he went, there was, and that's why I said the book was, surprisingly easy. You have to invest time and effort and ingenuity to find your sources and your research, but it was all there.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't like looking for fool's gold. It was all there,
Yeah.
and it simply had to be mined and then put into an order, and then you find the themes and the ideas of the story. But I'm saying he was living. The life is very exciting and entertaining up until he calls action on the first take of Citizen Kane. This, by the way, was exactly the pitch of the book, except without any details. And I'm just saying I'm lucky that it turned out to be true. That the pitch that I made
Yeah.
verbally over the phone with my editor, that he liked a great deal, that it turned out to be accurate. But that's partly what you do in my business. You have intuition and hunches that work out. But this, like I said, it wasn't reading the microfilm of the Kenosha News for 30 years. Was probably the worst part of the book, for the research, but got really wonderful results. But I was going to other prep schools and looking at their archives. There was stuff. Here, there's stuff from Todd School in various places, because Todd School had gone out of business. And there were great, great records. You just had to go gather them all up.
I have, in my life, I've had the opportunity to talk to many authors, both professionally and just kind of socially. But honestly, Patrick, I don't think I've ever talked to an author with still, after the project is completed, with still so much fascination, so much enthusiasm about the subject that he or she just wrote about. I mean, I
Well,
mean, it's just all, it's
you
great.
know what? I don't ever think about it. But honestly, I was chortling while I was doing the work because it was so entertaining. The
That's
guy,
true.
I mean,
Chortling's a good word. I
yeah,
think,
I was chortling because first I was going, it's like greedy. Oh, I found this
yeah, yeah,
little jewel here, I found this little jewel there, but it was all over the place. And
yeah,
eventually the book is like 700 or 800 pages long, and
yeah.
and my editor, nearly had a heart attack when I
I'm
delivered it.
sure. I'm
And
sure.
I said, I think it's good, and he eventually loved it, and he agreed, and we didn't. Um, look, it's an extreme work because it took an extreme idea and it went the whole way with it. But like I said, if the guy's name was Joe Johnson, it would still be an entertaining story. The fact that it's Joe Johnson who calls the first take on Citizen Kane at the end of the book, and you've seen the whole film foreshadowed in various ways,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you know that he went on to an amazing career and fame and success and renown afterwards, makes it better. But I was chortling every day. I'd come back from Kenosha, my eyes blinded and
Sure.
tired of the drive, and I my wife would say, how was it? And I'd be chortling,
You chortled to
because
her, sure.
you would find, I mean, who knew his birth would be on the front page, and
Right,
that his parents would be so
right, right.
well known that they're in the paper constantly, who they're dining with. The show business personalities came from Chicago to have dinner with them, or they'd come from Chicago on tour, meet them, and go over to their house. So a lot of the great old actors that Orson idealized or idolized and later on worked with, he met
Yeah,
at his parents' dinner table.
crazy. It's a crazy story. Can
Yeah,
I have a selfish question for you. I know it's
yeah.
probably covered a great deal in your book, so I apologize for even asking, but I believe War of the Worlds, the radio program, was before Citizen Kane, correct?
Yes, it's in there. Yes, it's in there.
I've often been uh, concerned about, not concerned, I've often wondered what Orson Welles' reaction was to the public's reaction of War of the Worlds. Did he think, hey, this is the greatest compliment of all time? These people are really buying this. Or did
Yeah,
he
now remember, most of the people performing War of the Worlds are the people who are later in Citizen Kane. So
Mhm.
he meets these people in New York, and that becomes part of the story too. Well, look, it was presented as a hoax. It
Yeah,
was
yeah.
they stated that it was a hoax, and uh, they were flabbergasted, to find out that people didn't realize it was a hoax, and then
Right.
they thought it was hilarious that
They
people
did.
didn't think it
Okay.
was a hoax.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Okay.
they went through the whole gamut of reactions, from disbelief to hilarity to like acceptance to like it's a very famous incident. So it takes up a big part of the book because once he leaves Wisconsin, which he leaves for good, he comes back a couple times. He lives near Lake Geneva for part of
Ah,
the time. He gets married to somebody from the suburbs of Chicago. And so he hangs around Wisconsin till maybe I'd have to go back and look, but like 32 or 33. He makes his first sort of student films here, and
mhm.
some of them can still be found and watched on YouTube. I think there's only a couple. And but once he finally leaves Wisconsin, then his fame and his career really becomes meteoric because the Mercury um, Theater, which was the people that put on War of the Worlds, they were extremely famous and popular
Sure.
and he was writing the scripts, directing the shows, starring in the shows, playing several roles, doing the advertisements for Campbell's Soup, whatever was necessary to get the show on. Meanwhile, he was also usually on Broadway at the same time. So he did
Oh,
under the Federal Theater, he did famous plays on Broadway and off Broadway, including All Black Shakespeare, the first All Black Shakespeare.
keep going.
Um, and so the story doesn't relent. Now,
Yeah. Yes.
it doesn't relent. So people would
Yes.
always say to me, would you want to go and do a volume two? And the answer is no, not at all. Because first of all, what happens is when people become really successful and they start uh, diversifying and expanding their reach in all kinds of media, and this is true, like let's say of Jack Nicholson after Easy Rider, then it becomes a lot more difficult to chronicle it in a straight narrative because the continuity becomes there's many wives, there's many projects that don't work, do work, and like I say, then you have to comment on each of the films,
Mhm.
and I wrote a book about Hitchcock also considered a definitive book. I don't think he ever came to Wisconsin, even though Psycho's author was born. Well, I don't know if he was born here, but he's from Wisconsin. But anyway, Hitchcock directed 53 films, produced another 10 or 15, did hours and hours of television, and has this. So you couldn't skip a movie.
Yeah.
Or somebody somewhere in the world would come after you with a
Yes.
cleaver. So it was a great relief to write a book which was entirely narrative adventure, and none of that, no film plot, synopsis, analysis, none of that. And if you got past Citizen Kane, you'd be stuck with a lot of problems writing about Orson Welles.
Sure. Is there a Orson Welles museum and Orson Welles anything down in Kenosha or Madison or anywhere here in Wisconsin?
You know what? The Orson Welles birthplace, which is where his mother and father were living when he was born, because might have been born in a hospital. I can't quite remember, but his birthplace is there with a plaque out front, and it shows you what a humble place these affluent middle class people lived in at the time. And there was talk of raising a museum, and there was talk of raising one in Woodstock. And honestly, to be honest, when I'm done with something, I move on and try and forget it, and I never go back to it. So I don't keep track. I'm pretty sure there's not, or I would have heard of it, but there's been talk of starting one. I don't know what would be in it, because you need the mementos and you'd have to get the sled from Citizen Kane, and you'd have to get his mother's outfit that she wore, the piano that she played, whatever, I don't know whether that's easily done, but it was easily done by someone to make sure they had the right house, get permission from current owners, and put up it's not a plaque, it's like a signboard in front that describes it as the birthplace of Orson Welles. I don't think I had seen it until after I was in the final stages of the book, and a friend was coming here from Spain to Chicago. And I said, would you like to meet in Kenosha, and we can go over and look at the house where Orson Welles was born, which is a good invitation. And it's unassuming. It's unassuming.
I can imagine. Right.
Yeah, I think the Howard Hawks house had a plaque up in Neenah. I don't think there's anything, because the Lozies were very prominent in La Crosse, very prominent, and the Nicholas Ray family was not as prominent, although his father was an architect. And there are no plaques or local museums. There should be.
You've been fun to listen to, Patrick.
Good. There could be,
shortly them all. I don't,
there's a Wisconsin Hall of Fame where various people from Wisconsin who are in the arts get into the Hall of Fame. And, there could be such a place, and it would be very nice, because, here in Milwaukee, you have people like Spencer Tracy and Pat O'Brien. And I don't know what is Milwaukee-ish or Wisconsin-y about those two people, except maybe they're sort of tough Irish urban edge to their performances. But I think you could get enough things to have a little museum. My son went to the same high school that later on, the High School of the Arts now, that was in those days the Spencer Tracy school, whatever school he went to. He went to several, but that was one of them. And I remember once I was there, the principal beckoned me in, and he had a couple yearbooks from the year of Spencer Tracy with Spencer Tracy in them, and he said he was going to put them on auction. What did I think? And I stupidly did not say, I'll buy one.
You've been fun to chortle with, Patrick.
Good. I hope it was good for you.
I really appreciate your time, and good luck with the book. Okay.
All right. Good luck. And if I can help you with something else, let me know, Bob.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay.